They told me I didn't own my own land at 3 a.m., and for a moment, even I wondered if the paperwork had somehow erased 20 years of my life. Headlights cut across the dry grass of my ranch as two patrol units rolled through the gate, tires grinding against gravel like they belonged there more than I did. Sheriff's radio chatter cracked through the cold air, repeating my name like it was a problem that needed solving. I stood on my front steps in a flannel shirt and worn boots, watching them treat a $6 million property like a disputed parking lot. Patricia Langford arrived next, stepping out of a white SUV with the kind of calm confidence people only have when they believe the system always bends toward them. She didn't look at the house first. She looked at me, like I was the mistake she came to correct. Behind her, a stack of printed documents fluttered in the wind, each page stamped with the Willowbrook Ranch Authority seal she claimed gave her jurisdiction. According to her, I was trespassing on restricted HOA-controlled land, and she said it loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I remember the way the morning wind carried dust across the yard, soft and slow, like the land itself was waiting for someone to get the truth right. Then came the officers, younger than I expected, careful with their words, but firm with their procedure. They asked me to step away from the gate, not with hostility, but with the kind of professional distance that makes you feel invisible on your own property. I didn't argue. I just asked one question: whether they had confirmed the property line with county records before responding to an HOA complaint. Their silence told me everything I needed to know. Patricia smiled, a small controlled expression, like she had already won before the conversation even started. This wasn't the first time she had used paperwork like a weapon. I could see it in the way she held the file, too clean, too organized, like reality only mattered when it was printed on her terms. That's when I noticed the second unit arriving, slower, heavier, as if the situation had quietly escalated without anyone saying it out loud. The air felt different now, not louder, just tighter, like the space between decisions was shrinking. I had lived on this ranch long enough to recognize when something was about to shift, and it always started like this, with confidence on one side and uncertainty on the other. I exhaled slowly, watching them draw invisible lines around my own life. I didn't know yet that one of those officers used to work under me years ago, before I ever owned this land, before any of them knew my name would matter here. The morning sun climbed higher over the fence line, and for the first time, I noticed how quiet everything had become, like the entire ranch was holding its breath. Patricia stepped closer to the gate marker, tapping it lightly with her finger as if ownership could be transferred through confidence alone. One of the deputies shifted his stance, glancing between my face and the file in her hand like the math no longer added up. I could feel the old habits coming back, the ones you learn when every decision used to carry real consequences beyond paperwork and signatures. But I stayed still, because rushing truth never helps it land where it needs to. In the distance, a vehicle door shut again, and I knew this moment wasn't going to end the way Patricia expected. The first real shift came when the second patrol unit stopped just beyond the fence line, its engine idling like it was waiting for permission that no one had clearly given. The officer stepping out was older, slower in movement, but sharper in presence, the kind of man who had seen enough disputes to recognize when something was not as simple as it looked on paper. He held a clipboard, but he did not open it right away. Instead, his eyes moved across the property boundary markers, then to the gate post, then finally to me standing on the steps. Patricia Langford immediately moved to fill the silence, sliding forward with practiced authority, repeating that I was in violation of community restrictions and refusing lawful compliance. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had never been told no in a room where she had already decided the outcome. The younger deputy beside her nodded along, reading from the printed complaint, but I noticed his eyes drift toward the older officer as if waiting for confirmation before committing to anything. That is when the older officer finally spoke, asking Patricia for the county parcel number. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the air to change. Then she handed over a highlighted document that looked official enough to convince anyone who did not already know what to question. The officer studied it, then looked back at the gate markers again, and I could see the quiet recalculation happening behind his eyes. Patricia tried to press forward, saying the HOA had full authority over perimeter enforcement, but the officer raised his hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to pause her momentum. He said he needed to verify jurisdiction before any removal could proceed. That single sentence shifted everything. The younger deputy stepped back half a step, lowering his voice as he spoke into his radio, requesting confirmation from dispatch. The wind picked up again, carrying the dry scent of earth and distant cattle pens, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so tense. Patricia looked at me then, not smiling anymore, but still confident, as if delays were just temporary obstacles to a conclusion she already owned. I did not move, because moving would have given the situation direction it did not deserve yet. The older officer walked a slow circle near the gate, studying the ground stakes and the worn tire tracks leading into the property. He asked when the last official survey had been conducted. I told him the year and pointed toward the old marker posts that had been set decades earlier by county survey crews. That is when he paused for a longer moment, long enough that even Patricia noticed the uncertainty forming. Her tone sharpened as she insisted the HOA map was the controlling document, but the officer finally shook his head slightly and said that HOA documentation does not establish legal ownership boundaries. The words landed heavier than anything else said that morning. I saw the younger deputy stop writing notes entirely. Patricia tried to recover, pulling out another folder, thicker this time, filled with amendments and meeting approvals, but no one reached for it immediately. The ranch suddenly felt less like a disputed property and more like a place where two systems of authority were colliding without a clear winner. I could hear a distant engine somewhere beyond the fence, maybe a ranch hand arriving late, maybe just wind moving through metal fencing, but everything else had gone still enough to make every small sound feel important. The older officer finally looked directly at me again, and this time his expression had changed, not friendly, not hostile, but familiar in a way I could not place yet. He asked my full name again, slowly, and when I gave it, something subtle shifted in his posture, like a memory had surfaced just beneath recognition. Patricia noticed the change too, and for the first time that morning, her confidence started to look like something she had to actively maintain rather than something she naturally carried. The moment my full name left his mouth, something subtle changed in the way the air moved between us. The older officer stopped walking the perimeter and turned back slowly, like he was aligning memory with reality. Patricia Langford noticed it immediately and tried to close the gap with more documents, but he did not look at her this time. He was looking at me with a quiet focus that did not match a routine property dispute. The younger deputy had stopped speaking into his radio, his hand hovering near the device, as if unsure whether to continue the request for jurisdiction confirmation. The older officer finally lowered his clipboard and said he needed a moment to verify something directly with county dispatch. Patricia's confidence tightened into something forced, her voice rising slightly as she insisted there was no need for delay, that the matter was already clear under Willowbrook authority. But the officer had already turned away, stepping back toward his patrol unit. I could hear the low crackle of his radio as he spoke my name again, slower this time, requesting a historical record check tied to prior service. That detail made Patricia pause for the first time. She looked at me differently now, not as a trespasser, but as an unknown variable she had not prepared for. The wind moved across the ranch again, carrying dust across the gate threshold, and I stayed still, watching the system I used to respect begin to question itself. The older officer returned within minutes, but his posture had changed. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked at the younger deputy and gave a small nod that shifted responsibility upward. Then he said something that made the younger deputy step fully back from the conversation. He confirmed that my name was associated with prior county oversight authorization years ago, before any HOA jurisdiction had been mapped onto this region. Patricia interrupted, trying to reassert that HOA agreements superseded historical county roles, but the officer finally shook his head more firmly this time. He said HOA agreements cannot override recorded county authority or established land titles. The words were calm, but they carried weight that silenced the moment. I noticed Patricia's hand tighten around her folder, the edges of her confidence beginning to crease. The younger deputy now avoided eye contact entirely, focusing instead on the ground near the gate marker. Then came the second shift, not from Patricia, not from me, but from the officer himself, who asked for confirmation of a secondary name associated with my property file. When I heard him say it, something inside the system visibly clicked. He was referencing Deputy Ryan Keller. I had not heard that name spoken in years, but the reaction it triggered was immediate. The younger deputy looked up sharply, and the older officer exhaled slowly, like a conclusion had just aligned itself into place. Patricia tried to interrupt again, but this time her voice did not carry the same control. The officer raised his hand once more, not to silence her, but to complete the verification process without distraction. The ranch felt quieter than before, as if even the distant wind had paused to listen. I watched the officer step aside and make a direct call through his radio channel, requesting immediate contact with Deputy Keller under field authorization protocol. Patricia's expression shifted for the first time into uncertainty she could not conceal. The system she had relied on was no longer responding to her in the way she expected, and she was beginning to realize that authority in this situation was not located where she assumed it was. The call went through within seconds, but nobody spoke for a long moment after the connection opened. I could hear faint background noise through the officer's radio, distant movement, and then a voice on the other end that made the entire posture of the scene shift again. The older officer straightened slightly as he confirmed identity, speaking carefully, as if each word carried procedural weight. Patricia Langford watched him with growing impatience, her confidence now visibly strained, her grip tightening on the folder she had used like a shield since she arrived. The younger deputy looked between both of them, waiting for instruction that no longer seemed simple. Then the name was repeated again through the radio, and everything slowed for a fraction of a second. Deputy Ryan Keller had been located and was en route. I noticed Patricia blink once, just once, but it was enough to show that she did not recognize the name and did not understand why it mattered. The older officer stepped slightly away from the group, lowering his voice as he spoke into the channel again, requesting expedited arrival and confirming my status file under county legacy records. Patricia tried to regain control of the moment, raising her voice just enough to assert authority over the confusion. She stated again that the HOA had issued a lawful removal request and that law enforcement was obligated to enforce community compliance. But the phrase sounded different now, less like instruction and more like repetition without support. The younger deputy finally spoke up, asking quietly for clarification on jurisdiction boundaries, and that question alone shifted the energy again. The older officer did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the ranch house, then the fence line, then the worn dirt path leading deeper into the property. It was the look of someone confirming physical reality against paperwork that no longer matched what was in front of him. Patricia stepped closer to the gate, pointing at the documents again, saying the HOA board had voted unanimously and that the property was under enforceable restriction. But no one reached for her papers this time. Even the wind seemed to move slower across the open field, flattening the grass in long, quiet waves. I stayed in the same position I had been in since they arrived, not because I was waiting for permission, but because I understood what was happening before anyone said it out loud. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice on the other end confirmed that Deputy Keller was less than 10 minutes away. The older officer responded with a short acknowledgement and then ended the transmission. When he turned back, his expression had changed from procedural caution to recognition of hierarchy that extended beyond this scene. Patricia noticed it immediately. Her voice softened slightly, but only enough to show uncertainty rather than surrender. She asked again what was being confirmed, but this time the officer did not answer her directly. Instead, he asked her to step back from the gate line until verification was complete. That request landed differently than before. It was no longer a discussion. It was a boundary being enforced. The younger deputy moved first, stepping back without hesitation, followed by the older officer, who kept his attention fixed on the road leading toward the ranch entrance. Patricia remained in place for a few seconds longer, still trying to hold on to the structure she had arrived with, but the silence around her was no longer responding to her authority. Somewhere beyond the fence, a vehicle approached, slow and deliberate, and I knew before anyone else spoke that the next arrival would not be part of the system Patricia thought she controlled. The sound of the approaching vehicle reached us before it ever appeared, a low, steady engine tone cutting through the open air like a signal everyone had been waiting for without admitting it. The older officer shifted his stance slightly, not stepping forward, but adjusting his posture in a way that suggested recognition rather than uncertainty. Patricia Langford turned toward the road immediately, her confidence returning for a brief moment as she prepared to reassert control over whoever was arriving. The younger deputy tightened his grip on his radio, watching the same direction without speaking. Dust began to rise at the far edge of the ranch road, rolling in thin layers across the sunlight, and then the vehicle came into view. It was not marked in a way that immediately demanded attention, but it carried a presence that changed the atmosphere anyway. The older officer exhaled slowly, almost as if confirming a prediction rather than witnessing an arrival. Patricia stepped forward again, beginning to speak before the vehicle even came to a full stop, repeating her authority over the property dispute as if volume could restore certainty. The vehicle door opened, and the first thing I noticed was the way the older officer immediately straightened, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement. Deputy Ryan Keller stepped out slowly, scanning the scene once, then twice, and then his eyes locked directly on me. There was no hesitation in his movement, only a brief pause that carried more weight than anything Patricia had said all morning. He did not speak to her first. He did not even acknowledge her presence. He walked directly toward the gate line, stopping just before crossing it, and for a moment the entire ranch felt like it had narrowed down to a single point of recognition. The older officer gave a small nod toward him, signaling confirmation without words. Patricia looked between them, her expression shifting from authority to confusion as she realized the conversation was no longer flowing through her. Deputy Keller finally spoke my name, slowly, with the kind of tone that belongs to memory rather than introduction. The sound of it changed something in the air again. The younger deputy lowered his gaze, stepping further back as if instinctively exiting a chain of command he suddenly understood he was not part of. Keller asked a single question, whether I was still maintaining oversight authorization under county legacy jurisdiction. The question was not casual. It was procedural, but it carried history inside it. I answered with a simple confirmation. That was enough. Patricia immediately tried to interrupt, stating that the HOA board had already issued binding enforcement orders, but Keller raised his hand slightly, not in dismissal, but in pause. He turned his attention toward the documents she was holding and asked to see them directly. For the first time, Patricia hesitated before complying. When she finally handed them over, Keller did not read them quickly. He reviewed them line by line, then looked up toward the gate markers, then toward the county line stakes further back on the property. The silence stretched long enough for the tension to shift direction. The older officer stepped closer to Keller and quietly summarized the jurisdiction review results that had just come through dispatch, confirming that county records did not support HOA enforcement authority over the parcel. Patricia's face tightened as she realized the words were no longer in her control. She tried to speak again, but her voice came out less certain, more fragmented. Keller finally looked directly at her, and when he did, the entire structure she had built around this moment stopped holding its shape. He asked her to step away from the gate and remain on the roadside until the matter was formally resolved through county protocol. It was not loud, not aggressive, but it was absolute. Patricia did not move immediately, but the hesitation in her stance showed the change had already happened. The ranch, the officers, the documents, everything had shifted into a different order of authority, and for the first time since the vehicles arrived, no one was looking at me as the problem that needed to be removed. The silence that followed Deputy Keller's order felt heavier than anything spoken that morning, not because anyone raised their voice, but because the structure that had supported Patricia Langford's confidence was no longer responding to her. She stood near the gate line, still holding her folder, but now it looked less like authority and more like something she was trying to remember how to use. Keller remained still, positioned between the officers and the property boundary, his attention split between the documents in his hand and the county landscape beyond the fence. The older officer stepped slightly to his side, speaking in a lower tone as he confirmed additional details through dispatch, referencing recorded jurisdiction boundaries and legacy oversight files tied to the ranch. I could hear fragments of the radio transmission, words like confirmation and historical parcel alignment, and each one seemed to remove another layer of certainty from Patricia's position. She tried once more to regain control, stating that the HOA board had acted within community enforcement guidelines, but her voice no longer carried the same weight. It sounded procedural now, rehearsed rather than authoritative. Keller finally closed the file in his hand and handed it back to her without urgency, then asked her a simple question about the source of her jurisdiction claim. There was no accusation in his tone, only clarity, and that clarity forced everything else to slow down. Patricia hesitated before answering, and that hesitation was enough. The younger deputy shifted his stance again, stepping fully off the gravel path and onto the roadside shoulder, as if physically distancing himself from a process that was no longer straightforward. The older officer turned slightly toward Keller, waiting for direction, and I noticed how naturally the chain of command had already reorganized itself without explanation. Keller spoke again, this time confirming that HOA enforcement requests could be logged, but they did not carry legal authority to remove an owner from recorded private property under county registry protection. The phrase hung in the air, not dramatic, just final. Patricia's expression tightened as she processed it, and for the first time, she looked back toward her vehicle instead of the gate, as if searching for an exit that did not require acknowledgement of failure. The wind moved across the ranch again, stirring dust along the fence line and carrying the faint sound of cattle in the distance. Everything felt slower, not calmer, just more deliberate. Keller stepped closer to the gate post and examined the boundary marker himself, then nodded once as if confirming what the records had already stated. He turned slightly toward me and asked for verbal confirmation of continuous occupancy and ownership history. I answered without hesitation, and that seemed to complete the verification cycle. Patricia attempted one final statement about community safety and neighborhood governance, but even she seemed aware it no longer fit the situation. Keller raised his hand gently, not to interrupt, but to signal closure on that line of argument. The older officer spoke quietly again into his radio, confirming that enforcement action was not supported under current jurisdiction validation. Patricia stood still now, no longer advancing, no longer retreating, just suspended in a moment where authority had shifted away from language and into record. Keller looked at her directly and instructed that any further action would require formal county review rather than field enforcement. There was no confrontation in his voice, only resolution. I watched as the realization settled across her face that the system she had relied on had reached its limit here. No one raised their voice, no one moved quickly, but the outcome was already decided in the space between verified records and assumed power, and for the first time since the patrol units arrived, the ranch belonged to the truth of its own documentation rather than the confidence of whoever arrived first to claim it. The moment the final confirmation came through the radio, the entire scene felt like it exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Deputy Keller stood near the gate post, listening to the last transmission from County Dispatch, his expression steady but no longer uncertain. The older officer beside him lowered his radio slowly, signaling that the verification cycle had completed exactly as the records indicated. Patricia Langford remained frozen near the roadside edge, her folder now hanging lower in her hand, no longer held like a shield, but like something she had forgotten to put away. The younger deputy had fully stepped off the property line now, standing at a respectful distance that matched the shift in jurisdiction that had just been confirmed. Keller finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a controlled finality that carried across the open air. He stated that based on county verification, no lawful grounds existed for removal or displacement from the property, and that all enforcement activity initiated under HOA authority was to be logged as non-executable without formal county escalation. The words did not need repetition. Patricia looked down briefly at her documents, flipping one page as if searching for a different outcome hidden inside the text. But nothing changed. The same paper that had given her confidence minutes ago now sat quietly in her hands without influence over what was happening. I noticed the older officer take a small step back, shifting his weight as if the operational responsibility had already moved away from the scene entirely. Keller turned slightly toward Patricia and instructed her to retain all documentation and submit it through proper county administrative review channels if she wished to pursue the matter further. There was no confrontation in his tone, only closure. Patricia tried to speak, but her words came out slower now, stripped of urgency, as if she was realizing that escalation required a foundation she no longer had access to. She glanced toward her vehicle again, then back at the gate, and for the first time, there was no attempt to project certainty. The younger deputy adjusted his stance, checking his radio once more, then letting his hand fall away from it entirely. The older officer confirmed one last time through dispatch that the situation was being cleared from active response status. The sound of that confirmation felt more significant than any argument that had taken place earlier. Keller stepped back from the gate line and finally allowed himself to look at the ranch without procedural distance, as if acknowledging what had been there the entire time. He did not need to ask further questions. The verification had already answered them. Patricia stood still, her presence no longer shaping the outcome, only observing it. The wind moved across the open land again, brushing through dry grass and along the fence posts, and the entire property felt unchanged physically but completely different in meaning. Keller exchanged a brief nod with the older officer, a quiet acknowledgement that the matter was resolved within the limits of authority. Then he turned slightly toward me, holding that position for a moment longer than necessary, as if confirming something beyond paperwork. No one spoke after that. The officers began to disengage from their positions, not abruptly, but in the calm sequence of a concluded response. Patricia remained near the roadside, no longer advancing any claim, no longer issuing any instruction, simply standing in the space where confidence had run out of legal ground. I stayed where I was on the steps, watching the structure that had arrived to remove me slowly reorganize itself around the reality that it could not. And for the first time since the patrol lights appeared, nothing about the situation was moving toward me anymore. The ranch was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight of authority that had filled it moments earlier was now dispersing like dust in the wind. Deputy Keller stood near the gate for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the last of the patrol structure disengage. The older officer had already turned slightly toward his vehicle, maintaining a slow professional withdrawal, but even in his movement there was a sense that the situation had concluded in a direction no one present could override. Patricia Langford remained near the roadside, no longer advancing, no longer speaking with certainty, only holding her folder as if it had become heavier without explanation. I could see her eyes shifting between Keller and the documents in her hand, searching for the point where control had slipped away. Keller finally broke the silence by instructing dispatch to close the active response file and mark the incident as jurisdictionally non-actionable under county enforcement standards. The words were procedural, but they carried finality. The younger deputy nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then stepped fully back toward his unit, no longer engaged in the dispute. The older officer followed, pausing briefly at his door before closing it, as if acknowledging that the boundary between perception and authority had been clearly defined here. Patricia attempted one last effort to speak, raising her voice slightly to reference HOA governance authority and community enforcement rights, but it no longer landed in the same way. There was no audience responding to it. Keller turned toward her calmly and repeated that any further claims must be processed through county administrative review rather than field enforcement, and that no immediate action would be taken based on HOA documentation alone. That sentence removed the remaining structure she had been standing on. I noticed her posture shift subtly, shoulders tightening not in defiance, but in recalibration. She looked down at her papers again, this time slower, as if reading them could restore the meaning they had lost. The wind crossed the ranch again, moving through the fence line and along the dry grass in long, steady waves. The sound of engines idling in the distance grew faint as the patrol units began to leave the property one by one. Keller stayed where he was for a moment longer, scanning the gate, the markers, and the land beyond with the kind of attention that comes from confirming reality rather than interpreting it. Then he stepped back from the threshold and allowed the space to settle into its natural state. Patricia stood alone near the roadside now, no longer part of any active process, only present in the aftermath of one. The confidence she had arrived with had not collapsed loudly. It had simply stopped receiving confirmation from the system she expected to support it. I remained on the steps, observing the final separation of roles as authority redistributed itself back to the structure that had always existed before anyone arrived. Keller exchanged a brief nod with the remaining officer, and without further instruction, the response unit fully disengaged. Vehicles turned slowly on the gravel, tires compressing the dirt in steady arcs before moving back toward the road. The sound of engines faded gradually, leaving only the open field and the distant movement of cattle beyond the fence line. Patricia did not follow immediately. She stayed still for several seconds, then finally lowered her folder completely, no longer using it as any form of argument. When she eventually turned back toward her vehicle, it was without the earlier certainty that had brought her here. The ranch was no longer under dispute in motion, only in record, and even that was no longer being decided in real time. The last patrol unit disappeared down the ranch road, and what remained was silence shaped not by tension, but by resolution. The last patrol vehicle disappeared down the ranch road until even the dust it left behind settled back into the earth, and what remained was a silence that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. I stood on the front steps watching the open gate, expecting some final word or lingering presence, but nothing came. Deputy Keller had already left without ceremony. The older officer had followed, and the younger deputy had gone with them, leaving only the outline of tire tracks as proof that any of it had happened at all. Patricia Langford remained near the roadside for a few moments longer, holding her folder loosely now, no longer aligned with her body like a tool of authority, but something she seemed unsure what to do with. She looked toward the ranch once, then toward her vehicle, and I could see the calculation in her expression slowly dissolve into something quieter, less certain. There was no argument left to make, no system left to appeal to in this moment, only the distance between what she believed would happen and what had actually been confirmed. She finally moved toward her SUV, walking without the same pace she had arrived with, and when she reached the door, she paused as if expecting the situation to reverse itself. It did not. The engine started, not sharply, but steadily, and she backed out of the roadside position without any further contact or resistance from anyone present. As her vehicle turned onto the ranch road and gradually disappeared beyond the gate line, the property felt like it was returning to its original state, not because anything had been taken away, but because nothing had been added that could override its record. I stayed outside for a while longer, not because there was anything left to resolve, but because I needed to register the absence of conflict in a space that had been defined by it only moments earlier. The wind moved freely across the open field again, and the sound of cattle in the distance returned with a kind of normalcy that felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had just occurred. I walked slowly down from the steps toward the gate, not touching anything, just observing how unchanged everything looked despite the weight of what had just been corrected through documentation and verification. The boundary markers stood exactly where they had always been, unaffected by the claims that had been made against them, and that detail felt more final than any instruction spoken earlier. There was no sense of victory in the air, only the absence of misunderstanding being enforced in real time. I could still recall the way Patricia had arrived with certainty, how quickly that certainty had shifted once jurisdiction was questioned, and how completely it had dissolved once county records were confirmed. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual removal of assumptions that had never been supported by authority in the first place. I looked down the ranch road where the patrol vehicles had disappeared, the same road that had carried urgency in one direction and silence in the other. Nothing about the land itself had changed, yet everything about how it was being interpreted had been corrected. I stood there for a final moment, letting the quiet settle fully, understanding that what had just happened was not about confrontation at all, but about which version of authority remained standing once every layer of assumption was stripped away. Then I turned back toward the house, and for the first time since the early morning lights had appeared at my gate, there was no question left about where I belonged.